Okay, thank you so much for everybody who has joined us today. I just want to say good afternoon. My name is Amanda Berry, and I'm the lead of the Office of Research Trainees at UHN. I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on writing competitive grant proposals. There will be two sections of the event today. In the first section, we will have Dr. Peter Sabatini, who will share strategies for writing compelling one-page research proposals. In the last half hour, we'll be joined by the UHN Research Grants team, who are with us here today, and who will provide guidance on how to apply to grants through UHN. We are grateful to be joined by so many UHN trainees and staff today, as well as so many trainees across Toronto. And we hope that you learn a lot of useful tools to help you to be successful in future grant applications. Now, before we get started, I want to acknowledge the land on which UHN operates. There's been a UHN hospital on this land since 1829, but long before that, Indigenous people were its stewards. They, as their descendants, and we at UHN do now, learned, shared knowledge, and healed each other. Regardless of where we sit today, we owe much to the territories that have called this land home. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here. We remember and honor the legacy of the peoples who have been here before us and all who work to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real. I would like you to take a moment to reflect on the land that you are on and what that means to you. Included on this slide is information for how you can receive your own land information and resources in order to learn more. Thank you. So next, I just want to share a few rules for making the webinar successful. Please remain muted and keep your video off unless instructed to do otherwise. The presentation will be recorded and available to all participants. By unmuting yourself or turning your video on, you're consenting to being recorded. I hope that you've all had a chance to review the ORT's Code of Conduct, and we appreciate you complying with our policies to respect everybody's learning experience. Now, before we get started, I just want to draw your attention quickly to two funding opportunities that are open until July 4th through the Office of Research Trainees. The OSOTF Unilever Lipton Graduate Fellowship is for graduate students who are studying in the fields of neurosciences at UHN and who are associated with the Faculty of Medicine. The ORT Conference Award Participation Award is for postdocs and grad students at UHN attending conferences between September and December. Please explore these grants on our website and apply soon. And with that, I'd love to get started. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Peter Sabatini. Dr. Peter Sabatini is currently the laboratory director for the Genome Diagnostic Laboratory at the University Health Network. Dr. Sabatini is certified in both molecular and cytogenetics with the Canadian College of Medical Geneticists, and his research focuses on improving genomic laboratory diagnostics by integrating novel technologies into routine clinical practice, specifically for tumor testing. In addition, Dr. Sabatini has partnered with the Graduate Center for Academic Communication since 2009 to discuss best practices and unique strategies when communicating scientific information in the life sciences. Let's all welcome Dr. Sabatini.
Okay, thanks very much, Amanda. So I'll just share my screen here. Okay, I just want to confirm that I'm sharing. Is this?
Yes, we can see your
slides. Okay, thanks very much. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Sabatini. As Amanda mentioned, I'm a lab director at the Genome Diagnostic Lab, and I also had partnered with the Graduate Center for Academic Communication, which offers a lot of different writing supports for individuals in the big spectrum of research in the university. So if you have any interest in sort of clinical diagnostic, I'm happy to engage with you on that side of things, but today we're just going to talk about kind of the writing side of things. So I'll get started here, and I just put this, it's a reference here, you can Google it, it's a free article. It's, I guess, old-ish at this point. I think in the early 2000s it was written, but not much, has changed in terms of writing. But I recommend all of you start with reading this afterwards. And they do state here, if the reader is to grasp what the writer means, the writer must understand what the reader needs. And a lot of the topics that we'll discuss today is sort of meeting those expectations of when you're writing, to meet the expectations of the reader. And when you do meet those expectations, then you get that writing clarity. So I will say, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, in the chat. And I'm not sure if you're able to unmute, but I'm happy if you're able to do that too. And we can chat as we go along, or you can save it for the end. So I want to start with some writing objectives, and ultimately we want to write with clarity. And so that's the quality and coherence of intelligibility. And obviously we all start wanting to do this. And then when you sit down to write, it becomes a lot more challenging. So what that means when we go to write is that we must be direct, concise, and almost as equally importantly, but often neglected, is to be intuitive. And all this intuitive part is what I'm really going to try to encourage you to write intuitively and give you kind of tangible ways to make that happen. But essentially, this all means that the reader knows what you're going to write before you actually write it. And that's how we become clear. Because if I'm anticipating what you're about to say, and then you say exactly that, then I'm clear and I can critically evaluate kind of the context for what you're writing on a much easier note. So what this means, and kind of a flavor for what we'll go through here, is I want to give you kind of more tangible ways of making this happen. So a home exercise of how you might actually get this to happen is if you give your background to someone to read, but not your hypothesis. So just the background, and then ask them to guess your hypothesis. So if they guess it correctly, then you've met their expectations. This is exactly how we achieve clarity. And if they guess it incorrectly, then you've done something wrong. You haven't met their expectations in any way. So this is gives a flavor for how I'm going to kind of outline all the writing context and exercises that we'll go through today. So in the writing process, we all know how to write. We're all very clear about this, but I want to start with these fundamentals and then build on them. So the first step here is understanding the writing expectation. So this is who you're writing to. And I understand I'm speaking to a wide group of individuals. So some are trainees, some may actually be staff writing for operational grants. But before you actually start writing, we have to understand what you're writing for. Is this for training? And the training, that money actually goes in your pocket to fund not the research, but your living. And they're expecting that the proposal is sort of going to fit with your training expectations. And this sort of in contrast to an operational grant, which would actually go to fund the actual research itself and not someone's training specifically. And then you go into the brainstorming and outlining, and then you make your draft. And after you have a draft, then you go back to review and edit. And then of course, when you get sick of doing that, then that's when you submit, or you're happy with it. So I have here just some arrows. One is just one long arrow, and some are kind of these smaller ones. And I think the important thing to note is that writing is never just one streamlined process. It is an iterative type of stepwise process where you might actually get stuck at this review and editing. And when you get stuck, it might be because you have to move back a few steps and reevaluate how you've maybe made your outline or brainstorm or understanding the writing expectations. And I think we should all be sort of aware of that, is that it's not necessarily your just writing skills per se, but it may actually be that you kind of skipped a step or didn't think about it enough to make it more streamlined. And that's where I think that it's important to note that we always have to sort of take a few steps back before we can actually move forward. Okay. So ultimately, when we think about proposal writing, it's a persuasive writing exercise. So we're just trying to persuade the person reading it that your project is valid. So we have to clearly understand their demands to make these valid arguments and claims. And this art of persuasion is not a new one. This is Aristotle. And I don't know if he was necessarily the first, but he's a famous philosopher who did sort of outline what is persuasion. And he had these thoughts that persuasion actually is separated into these three areas. So the logos, which would be needing to be logical and intuitive. The next would be pathos, having emotional appeal, and then the last being ethos, and that's having the credibility. So maybe who's writing it or the way in which you write. And I'll come back to this later, but I've sort of separated out the talk in these three areas. And we'll start with this: how do you actually write intuitively and logically, and what does that actually mean? So I want to start here because with the lay abstract, and so many applications require you to write a short paragraph for a lay abstract for a lay audience, which essentially means not belonging to a particular profession. And it's important to start here because this essentially establishes the correct narrative. So when you're the narrative or the story that you're trying to impart on the reader will be different depending on who it is. And so a lay person will gravitate more towards a rhetorical type story. So one that might really hinge on the greater health issue at hand, not specifically what you're doing in the laboratory, but a scientist reviewing your project will be more engaged in the research story. Like, what exactly are you studying and what's the story in terms of the laboratory components of it. And you have to separate those two before you start writing, because you can't write without a narrative. And importantly, and what I want you always to remember is that as scientists, we have a narrative. We are telling a story, even though as we think of science as not necessarily being like a classic storyboard, we are exactly the same as those fiction novelists, but you have to separate the correct story for the correct audience. So in a lay abstract, we want to first define the overall health issue. And again, we're sort of focusing in on the bigger health issue, the rhetorical type narrative, describing the gap in the knowledge and then what you're doing, and then how the research might improve the health issue at hand. And I pull an example here from CBC because they're kind of experts in this and they're always writing to the lay audience. And I would recommend, if you are needing to write a lay abstract, that you consult with this, maybe like the health column at CBC or any other journal or newspaper, public newspaper, that in those columns, these would be the types of language that you might want to use. So here we're talking about stem cells, and they're sort of focusing in on the bigger issue, but not exactly what the person is doing in the lab. So skin cells can become stem cells. It's a remarkable development from Toronto's Mount Sinai. The new reprogramming method replaces a process that until now was done using viruses and carried the risk of damaging cell DNA and causing cancer. So here we're talking about cancer, the bigger issue, not the lab specific. So instead, it allows stem cell DNA to be inserted into a skin cell and removed after the skin cell transformed into a stem cell. The created stem cells are safer and they don't require the use of embryonic stem cells. So I'll start with that, but I do have an example from a real excerpt and just highlighting the narrative here, that we're really narrowing in everything that we say, sort of coming back to this consistent story of the more rhetorical type, bigger health issue, like curing cancer or curing cardiovascular disease, as is this case. So cells accumulate inside injured arteries that then block blood flow and contribute to the leading cause of death in North America, cardiovascular disease. My project focuses on the movement of cells and blood vessels of injured arteries, and my research will use isolated cells to study how they migrate in specific directions, a process important to the progression of cardiovascular disease. So I just want to highlight here that at the end of the sentence there, they have redirected it back to that narrative of the importance of cardiovascular disease as that rhetorical narrative. A greater understanding of how and why these cells move will help generate more effective treatments to stop the buildup of cells that block blood flow. So when we switch towards a proposal where we're writing towards peers, let's say, or other scientists, you have to have an answerable question, hypothesis, objective, or specific aim. And so your narrative is completely different than what you might write for a lay audience. And a scientist actually will be more engaged in this type of narrative because that's what they're looking for, is something answerable and important. And what I want you to do now, and I've designed this kind of lecture or workshop to be a little introspective, where I want you to stop and think about your own projects. And I want you to write down your rhetorical research question and also write down your testable research question. So I have some examples here. So can using single cell sequencing methods improve cancer diagnosis and treatment? I would consider that a rhetorical type of research question in the context of this research project, because that's not really what they're studying. They hope it will help ultimately, but that's not really the answerable one. The testable one is actually, can using single cell sequencing methods reliably detect both clonal and subclonal cancer cells? And that's what the lab component is. And so in a proposal, this testable story would be what they would be narrowing in on. So I'll just give you a little bit, like 30 seconds or 1 minute to think about it. And I encourage you to actually write these down so that you can really differentiate the two different narratives. Okay, let's move forward. If you have questions as we go along, again, feel free to put them in the chat, or you're having trouble maybe with some of the exercises that I have you do to kind of reframe how you might write or think about your projects. Just please let me know and we can talk. And I should say, it's such a wide range of projects out there that it's hard to kind of discuss writing because everyone's has unique challenges. And so you may have one that you might think is unique to you, but for sure there's somebody else who might relate to your questions. So some basic elements when we start the research proposal, and this is, we're trying to create an obvious story. So I'm already anticipating what you're writing. So in the intro, of course, we just introduce what we're studying and that we're remembering that we're setting up the research question, not the rhetorical one. And this is very critical. Then the hypothesis comes and it should just be obvious already. You're only stating it because you have to, but I should already anticipate what it is. So that's what you think. And then the methods would be what you're going to do about it and then why. And then finally, the impact being who should care. So those are kind of the basic elements, and I'm going to build on those there. So I mentioned about the scientific narrative, that we really aren't any different than fiction novelists. And I think we should pull from some of the kind of the poetic structures that they use so well, and that society sort of really engages with in our science proposals, because our stories look exactly the same. And, you know, their settings, initial incident, consequences, and conclusions look just like our background, hypothesis, methods, and conclusions. But two of the ways in which fiction novelists make their stories incredibly compelling and persuasive are foreshadowing and having these strong character motivations, which I will elaborate on more. So foreshadowing being sort of anticipating what might happen next, and strong character motivations just making sure that, you know, the methods that we have actually make sense, but we have to write that so that the reader actually knows or understands why you might use those methods. So we'll start with foreshadowing. And of course, in the intro you're foreshadowing essentially just the hypothesis. And I think that we all start like this, but science, of course, is complicated. we have hundreds of years of scientific methods and information that we might think we want to sort of incorporate. But what happens is often if we incorporate too much peripheral information that's not directly related to the hypothesis, suddenly almost the most important part of a proposal becomes diluted out because you've incorporated information that might be somewhat related but not directly related. And then the importance of the hypothesis becomes minimized, and then I can't anticipate what that is. So now let's move on to sort of brainstorming and making an outline. So this is where you have creative freedom of your discourse. You can say what you want, when you want, and how you want. But importantly, we have to meet the reader's expectations. So this is often a misquote, and it might seem strange why I add this here, but this kind of creative part, he is misquoted as saying, write drunk and edit sober. But what I mean by this is when we make our outline, this is where we need to start and brainstorm. This is the creative part. And so we want to use whatever tools we need to create an obvious story, and that might require some very creative ways of doing things. And so that's where we're going to start. And then later at the end of the talk, I'll talk about editing, which is more about the specific details about the words that we use, which comes later after you write your draft. So let's start with this logical and intuitive part. So that's the creative, and some might say the most fun part. Depends, everyone's kind of has their own opinion. So the logic is conveyed through internal consistency of the message, clarity of the claim, and logic of its reasons, and effectiveness of its supporting evidence. So we know this is all very obvious, but how do we translate this into writing? So the best projects here, they have intuitive research questions and hypotheses, but I would say 99% of you don't have the luck of having a project that's just naturally intuitive. What you need to become is these science writers or scientists that are creating these common sense hypotheses. So we can do that by first having a logical flow, which I think we all do. We start with the intro, hypothesis, methods, but what we have trouble doing, and which I'll help you with today, is to design a clear story that makes the hypothesis seem obvious, and then the methods would naturally make sense. So what I'm going to do is go through each section, and what I'll have you do is sort of start by having you write something down, and then I'll talk a bit about it, and then you'll change it based on what I talk about. So if you open a new page, or if you have a loose leaf piece of paper, you want to write these down, I'll give you a minute to write your title at the top of your page. So we don't have lots of time, so don't think too much about it. But if you have one already, that's great. But I'll just give you a minute to write that down.
All the way. He's really cute. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll continue now. Right, so the title, it's a great place to foreshadow, obviously. It's the first thing everyone reads. And so how might you foreshadow? So here we have some common titles. And remember, we want to be direct, concise, and intuitive, and maybe foreshadow something exciting. So the role of smooth muscle cell migration and atherosclerosis. And of course, this would be a very vague title. It's one that we often see, but this doesn't really help in terms of setting up the research question or the research story that I want to engage my reader with. So we might think about including something more exciting or foreshadowing, maybe a method. So use of multiphoton microscopy to visualize smooth muscle cell migration in mouse models of atherosclerosis. So here we have a more informative title that actually would foreshadow sort of this use of microscopy or visualization tool in this study. And another same very vague, so characterization and rescue of mouse models of conduction abnormalities. And essentially, we can be a lot more specific by including maybe even just a buzzword that might help narrow in the reader's context for where you might be going. So characterization and rescue of mouse models of conduction abnormalities using stem cell therapies. So this actually has a very powerful way of narrowing in the reader's expectations. Okay, they're going to be talking about stem cell therapies, whereas before it's sort of open-ended and not overly helpful. So another maybe palliative care ethics in Canada. This again could be anything, but if this is more qualitative type study, even just including that framework, the conceptual structure of palliative care ethics in Canada will influence the reader's perception of where this project actually might sit. And it's an important place to foreshadow in the title. So other ones may be a question. So do superantigens play a role in Kawasaki disease progression? And it's hard to say if you should use a question or not. I think the general idea is to not. And the goal is to portray confidence in your project. And a question sort of insinuates that you don't really know the answer. And ultimately, I agree we don't know the answer, but that's not how you persuade someone that they should fund a project. So the confidence of a statement that the project has to be done imparts a more persuasive type tone, and that's why we suggest not to use questions. So what I'd like you to do now is to remember that here's a great place to foreshadow, and to change your title to be maybe foreshadow something about your project that you think might be important. So it could be a research technique. Often that works very well, and to portray some kind of confidence. So if you aren't happy with your title after this conversation, then I want you to rewrite your title to foreshadow some important aspect, like your methods. So I'll give you a moment to just think about that and then rewrite it on the top of your page. Okay, I'll move forward. It's hard for me to tell if people are still sort of thinking or not, just the virtual nature of this. But yeah, if there are any questions or problems, let me know, please. But we'll move forward. So after the title actually would come the background. The problem is, without knowing your hypothesis, you can't write a background. So we can't actually go in that order in this lecture, because I want you to create your hypothesis before you even start thinking about your background, because that is actually what's driving what happens in the background. So we have to make a good one. So now, I guess, I don't know, a third the way down your page, you can write down your hypothesis. So I've modeled this lecture on the CIHR applications for the doctorate awards. I know that not everyone is in that bin, but I think a lot of you will have to kind of write a similar type of proposal. And so those are just one-page proposals, which is almost, some might say, an impossible thing to do, but that's what they ask. And so we're going to try to make this as concise as possible. So a hypothesis should really be one sentence. And so if you want to just write your one sentence hypothesis there. So I hypothesize that and whatever, and I'm going to help you recraft it. Okay, I'll move forward. So this is kind of one of my favorite parts, actually, because the hypothesis is so critical that if a tired person is reading a proposal, I shouldn't say that, a tired scientist is reading a proposal, I hypothesize that will always snap them back into attention. And so you want to make sure that you have a standalone sentence that kind of can be interpreted and understood very clearly. So the definition, of course, we already know this, but it's a proposed possible explanation for phenomenon, set of circumstances, a theory. It's got to be specific, answerable, direct, informative, and most importantly for a clear story is intuitive. How do we make that happen? So I have two examples. The first one's not obviously a real study. I just use it for kind of a proof of concept here. And the second one is real. So the first one here, I hypothesize that Billy will run fast. And the second one, describing and critically analyzing palliative care ethics in Canada can contribute to its development and improvement. So I put these up because these are, typical hypotheses, although they're not intuitive on their own. And that's because they're missing a critical part of the definition of a hypothesis. And it should really have two parts. Those ones only had one. And so the hypotheses that we should be generating should include the phenomenon and the possible explanation. They're often only include the possible explanation, but that sort of neglects the whole phenomenon part. And we can actually do this in one sentence. And I would encourage you to try to make that happen because it's such an important part of a proposal that if you are the 10th or 5th one that I've read, I will be tired and I might miss things, but when I get to your hypothesis, if I can get a clear, intuitive sentence, then I can understand what you'll be writing next. So that phenomenon we can include here. So Billy is in a race. That's this one's very simple, but therefore I hypothesize that Billy will run fast. So that's a complete hypothesis. It's got the phenomenon as the race and then my proposed explanation. And then the second one being a real example. So palliative medicine has within it ethical tension. And so that against the phenomenon. So then describing and critically analyzing it can contribute to the development of palliative care ethics in Canada. So these on their own would be intuitive by nature. So I can understand sort of the context for why you might be thinking or why your hypothesis may be the way it is, because you've briefly described your phenomenon. So some other examples that may help is just granzyme B activates upstream inhibitors of IAP. Therefore, I hypothesize that granzyme B inhibits IAP to promote apoptosis. Or since pedometers have been described as a valid and reliable method in counting steps, I hypothesize that this method of measurement is feasible in setting of emergency department to improve recovery. You may also want to include preliminary findings. So since I have recently shown that actin and microtubule networks polarize during migration, I hypothesize that adhesion molecules control their polarization to regulate cell migration. So the best hypothesis and research projects are intuitive, but again, those barely happen. So you have to create that. So you can create them by starting the sentence with known information and then ending with your ideas. So remember that hypotheses are two parts. So I want you now to recraft your hypothesis with this new information. So you might consider starting it like since this, then, or I have shown that, therefore, or considering something then. And so I'll ask you to rewrite your newly crafted two-part intuitive hypothesis. So some questions I often get are for hypothesis generating projects. You might want to focus on the method as being the driver. So for example, whole genome sequencing will discover novel targets. So that would be the kind of part of the hypothesis. So the method being the driver. And then for qualitative studies where you might not think you have a hypothesis, there's always a hypothesis in there, even if just that understanding the themes will help. That's the hypothesis there. So critically analyzing these themes will benefit. And so I encourage you to find a hypothesis in there somewhere and create a two-part. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that and write that down. I'll just say that this is hard. I'm asking you to reduce down a whole background essentially into half a sentence. But this is so critical because then it forces you to think about what's actually important and also meet my expectations as a reader so that I can be clear about what the story is. All right, let's move on. I'll just wait and see. I don't know if anyone has questions or any problems with what I've brought up here. Okay, I don't see anything yet, but we can always revisit. That's no problem. So now we can move into the background because we actually know what the phenomenon is that we've decided is the most important part of my hypothesis. And that really is all that the background's got to describe is that phenomenon. And that's what you're setting up. So those examples that I have, that part in bold is really what the background, all it has to do is focus on that part and the problems with it. And that will create a very obvious story where then I can actually just anticipate what the hypothesis is before you even say it. So we'll go to the background now. And so again, we'll start with the basics and then I'll kind of build. So we want to describe what we're working on and what are these set of circumstances. So it could be previous observations or historical theories. Every project's different. So the structure of your background is sort of hard to describe, but I'm going to talk about some general themes here. So, but the most important part is acknowledging that gap and state a probable solution, which conveniently would be your hypothesis. So let's start with the first sentence. So I'll get you to write your first sentence down. And again, don't think too much about it. If you already have it, that's great. If not, just whatever comes to your mind. And I'll give you a moment just to get that first sentence out. Okay. So it's hard to say what parts are, the most important parts of the proposal, but of course the first sentence would be quite, one of the top things. So we want to engage the reader right away. And often the first sentences start with these types of sentences. And then as I read them, I want you to think about, is this helping set up a research narrative or a rhetorical one? So abnormalities in cardiac rhythm account for more than 250,000 deaths per year in the US. Or cytotoxic T lymphocytes mediated cell death is pathologically important during organ transplant rejection and autoimmune disease. And then finally, HIV and TB infections are often found together and accelerate each other's progression. So I have a question here. So is it a good idea to start the first sentence with your goal? So yeah, I'm gonna, in the next few slides, my answer is yes, basically, but I'll elaborate on that. Yeah. So in these, it's not clear what's happening in the lab necessarily. So the last one, for example, HIV and TB infections are often found together and accelerate each other's progression. I have no clue what this person's project would be or where they're going with it. It could be anything. So as a reader, I'm still unclear. It's an interesting sentence, but I'm unclear still, so I'm waiting. And that's not how you want to treat your reader. So when I think about this project, it is actually about kind of the socio-medical aspects, and we can actually influence the reader's perception of the project right away, which is so critical for you to do to meet their expectations. And it's incredible relief for the reader to know where you're going. So instead of both HIV and TB infections accelerate each other's progression, we can be more specific to the project. Biologically, co-infection of HIV and TB accelerate each other's progression. However, the socio-medical aspects of combined care remain inadequately addressed. And so this answers the question, is it a good idea to start the first sentence with your goal? For me, and I think many readers, the answer is yes. For a scientist, this is an incredibly compelling statement that is a perfect first sentence, because I know exactly where I'm being led down. So you have an opportunity here to set the research stage right away in the first sentence, and you can foreshadow your hypothesis. And again, you're setting up this research question or narrative that should be addressed right away, especially if you only have one page. So just as more examples, instead of these abnormalities in cardiac rhythm account for 250 deaths per year in the US, which it's important, but not helpful in setting up that narrative. The study is more about this. So murine embryonic stem cells can differentiate into cells of the cardiac conduction system, and therefore could serve as cells to develop a biological pacemaker. So here we're narrowing in on what this project might be, is about developing a pacemaker. And the last one, the CTL-mediated cell death is pathologically important during organ transplant rejection and autoimmune disease. So the project's actually about granzyme B, so why not introduce that right away? So granzyme B release from CTLs induces cell death by activating unknown pro-apoptotic factors and stimulates organ transplant rejection. So again, as you think about this, the narrative is already being brought up right away. So I'm not left in the dark as a reader. And this is exactly how we meet their expectations and create these intuitive type stories. So I want you to rewrite your first sentence. So this might be something like whatever, blah, 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 but this is unknown, or it is inadequately addressed. So you don't necessarily have to enter at such a specific level. You may want to kind of start broad and then narrow in, but something's got to be unknown. For me as a scientist, I want to know that the story is what's wrong. But it may take you a few sentences, but essentially you're kind of narrowing in on the lab component, which may take a few, but at least help me understand at the disease level what the problem is, and then bring me into the lab if it seems a little too intense to just jump right into the technical parts of your project. And again, this is where those creative tools that you might draw on come into play, because it's hard. Writing is hard. Writing intuitively is even harder, and writing scientific, discourse is even harder. So we have a challenge, but it takes some time. So I'll give you a moment, yeah, to rewrite your first sentence there. I see a question about the session is being recorded. So I'll let Amanda comment later about where to find it, but yes, it is recorded. Thanks. Yeah, so I'll just read this. The recording will be emailed to all the registrants. So yes, you'll get that there. Okay, I'll move on just so we can stay on time. But that's the first sentence. And then the rest of the background, of course, is going to depend on your own project. And so that's a hard one to talk about. But your structure may look different. So we have some that might have sort of isolated statements where you have say this and then something unrelated, and then, or you may have these linear linking statements, which some call kind of an inchworm kind of thing, where, you know, projects with signaling pathways might use this. So this leads to this, and then that leads to something else. And then the last being a central linking statement. Every background sort of got to look a bit different, but the key here is that internal consistency of the message. And I think that the central linking statement, so anything you say has got to come back to the problem in the background. It's useless to say something if it doesn't have some kind of tie to the research narrative that you want. If it's not contributing, it doesn't need to be in there. And so writing with these central linking statements where you might say something different, but linking it back to the same thing is how you drive home the message to the reader. So we have kind of this old information where we call this the topic position, and then you might transition into that new information, the stress position, which would be kind of that the research question or that narrative that you want to drive home for them. And a lot of backgrounds kind of use that structure, which we'll kind of build on a bit as we go along as well. So here is just a short background, and what I've done here, I won't read it right now, but I've highlighted just the beginning parts of the sentence. So it starts with cytotoxic T lymphocytes, then it moves to purpurine, and then it goes to granzyme, which is what the project's actually about. So it's taken 3 sentences of me as a reader, not kind of in the dark. And so I can't really interpret why I'm being told these things until the last part of it, which doesn't make sense. You want to really flip the order. So I'm going to redo this in a sense here to really highlight on granzyme. So I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to read sort of the revamped one just because it's more helpful. So granzyme B is a powerful pro-apoptotic serine protease that regulates cytotoxic T lymphocyte cell death through unknown regulatory pathways. So here I am moving into the scientific narrative, and I know already that this project's going to be about something about granzyme B and unknown regulatory pathways. So disrupting granzyme B inhibits apoptosis through the classic IAP-dependent pathway, although granzyme B and IAP do not directly interact. So what I'm trying to say here is these central linking statements that I've said something different, but I've brought it back into the same narrative that I want. So the signaling space in between granzyme B and IAP is therefore currently unknown. So I kind of am anticipating what the hypothesis probably is going to be. it is critical to understand the apoptotic signaling mechanisms in order to find treatments for pathologies related to aberrant apoptosis, such as organ transplant rejection. So that sentence that you might think should go at the top, like the overall health issue, actually it's buried in below because that's not the focus of the research proposal. So the focus of my research proposal is to discover these unknown factors, then your hypothesis would come after that. So this is where we have that internal consistency of the message. It is by repetition, but it's through different contexts, but you have to be clear about what the research narrative is and drive that in with everything that you're saying, linking it back to what that message would be. So that is essentially your story, and what you have to start by picking that story. And that's why I really focus on that scientific narrative as being important, and you are storytellers and you should consider yourself as that and start writing as a storyteller. So to summarize the background, so that first part of the hypothesis should be the focus of your background. I would define the research topic right away, and then the health issue would naturally come after, and make sure that the first part of each sentence is kind of consistent, and especially the last part being that driving it into what's unknown. So I had mentioned this before, but giving your background to a colleague, they should be able to guess your hypothesis or your objectives, and that will tell you that you've done your job as an effective writer. So now we can move into the methods part, which ultimately you are writing to prove that your methods is the best one and that you have all the best help available to you. And then if it's for training, these would conveniently all complement your career goals. So we'll start here again by, I want you just where your methods might go in your outline section, just as bullet points, write down 2 or 3 methods that you would use. So some examples obviously would be technologies that you'd use in the lab, maybe cell lines, maybe a database that you pull from, or like a questionnaire specifically, like maybe you have a specific questionnaire that you have, you can take that, or a population of people also is considered a method that you might survey. Yeah, so just as bullet points, and then we'll add a sentence after. Okay, so yeah, I say 2 or 3, but I don't know, every project's different. So if it's 1, then great. If it's many more, you can put more than 3. I just, for those 1-page CIHR proposals, it's kind of hard to put many, but anyway. So let's move forward here. So when we talk about the methods, all of these interrogative pronouns have to be addressed. 4 of them by nature just get answered no matter what, but there's one that's most important. It doesn't get answered unless you actually make it happen. So there's the who, what, where, and when. I think as we just write the methods, those naturally come up. It's the why that you have to make happen that's the most important. So remember, we're trying to persuade people, and we don't persuade people without explaining why. And that's, again, these strong character motivations. So those fiction novelists, they build personalities and give a background to the character to make you believe why they behave the way they do. But the writer has actually taken the time and the effort to tell you about these things. As scientists, you have to take the time and the effort to explain why this method is important and what those results would show that is so important. And that often gets neglected and makes for like that persuasive attitude in the proposal is missing if you don't build that in there. So you can't just list what, you have to list why for an effective proposal. So that's because we're trying to persuade the reader. So we do this by focusing on describing what the results will show. And when we do that, it actually, on top of persuading the reader, because you're describing why, it actually also forces you to be accountable to your hypothesis. So a lot of the evaluations of the proposals are, do these methods answer the hypothesis? And if you aren't accountable in your writing, then it might not be. You might get lucky, and yes, it does. But if you aren't explicitly accountable as you're writing, then you may miss out on that opportunity. And it's a simple connect. You just have to think about it and make it happen. So here's where that logic of its reasons comes in. And it sounds simple. Just simply explain to me why. And it may actually be that simple, but let's see what happens here. So in the methods, there may be different frameworks. Every project's different. So again, it's hard to talk to people about how to write in methods because every project's super different. And so here's how some might look is you might have a model system and you might describe how you'll use it to evaluate your hypothesis. So maybe a knockout mouse is a good example. Very powerful projects are picking 3 ways to show the same thing. So every method's sort of not perfect. So you may have 3 different methods to show the same thing, which is a very powerful and compelling project for many scientists. It may just be that you're establishing a method and then you're going to test it to see if it works. And so that would be your inputs being what you hope to happen. And then that testing would be sort of the outputs being, did it actually happen? And then a list describing how you'll meet these objectives, which is common for the qualitative type studies. I don't need to read all this just because what I'll describe here is this overall framework. So what's being described here is the who, what, where, and when. So it's just saying that they'll develop a set of body language cues for autism spectrum disorders, and then just, again, sort of telling me what they're doing. But what's missing here is why. And I'm going to add why here. So the second paragraph is the same. It's the who, what, where, and when. But what I've done here is explain the reason why at the top by kind of looking at an overall framework. So I will use a mixed method approach to determine the range of body language cues and engage with parents and instructors to interpret the cues. So the overall framework's this mixed method approach. So before I get into specifics, it's kind of looking at this overall framework, which might be the 3 different ways to show the same thing, or to use a knockout mouse, but just something high level that you can explain what's so important about. So here's the why. The mixed methodologies provides both qualitative and quantitative parameters that will guide the instructor's engagement with the child. I've submitted an application for Research Ethics Board approval that was recently accepted. And then below is a little more of the specifics about kind of the who, what, where, and when. I added this last sentence for it can be a benefit for any type of proposal, whether it be for an operational grant or a training grant. But these little details do influence the reader's perception of the project and the momentum. So this is a great training opportunity. So it's good to have that in there. And especially if that's like a REB approval, something that you've put together and been part of the review process, that shows that you're getting good training, because that's an important aspect, and also that the project is sort of moving forward. So if you have that, that's an important thing to include. So I added the last one here as a step-by-step approach, which is a very common type of project, and I think most of them are modeled this way. So I can't really do the next step without doing this one first. And although we might do that in the lab, it's not a good way to persuade someone of a good project. And I'll explain to you why. So here we have one that is, I shall first determine whether CMIB is at all expressed during the time window defined above, and if so, how does its expression level change? I will then employ transient transfection to express wild type dominant negative or siRNA to abolish CMIB translation with the purpose of increasing endogenous CMIB activity in the time window defined above. What this does is it provides a big risk for the project to move forward. If the first part doesn't work, then the whole project stops. And that may be how it works in the lab, but that's not how you want to frame it in the proposal. You want to put it as all results being meaningful, no matter when or what I do. And so you have to use your creative writing skills to frame it in a way that doesn't have that potential high risk, because that's not a way to persuade someone that this is a viable project to fund. So I've changed this to say, I will analyze endogenous MIB expression levels during cell differentiation using Western blot to observe protein levels. So who, what, where, I guess when. These results will correlate CMIB and cell differentiation, so a bit of the why. However, to prove a causal relationship between CMIB and cell differentiation, I will impair the activity of CMIB prior to differentiation. So then using transient transfection to abolish, I will express wild type CMIB, a dominant negative CMIB and siRNA knockdown to abolish CMIB translation and analyze differentiation markers. These experiments are necessary to show that CMIB promotes cell differentiation. So a simple statement to explain the why. So you have to add why, you have to add what the results will show, and this is where you want to focus on the methods part. So you have to frame it as all the results being meaningful and that the experiment has to be done. And that may require some contemplation and creative kind of restructuring, but this is how you want to frame it. And that makes for a compelling project for me as a reader, that no matter what, this experiment just has to be done, whether it goes in the direction you want it to or not. It needs to get done. Someone's got to do it. So I want you to write for each method beside each bullet point something that these results will show that because, or maybe this technique is required or is the best because. So these sentences might make it into your proposal, but this will force you to be accountable for ensuring that the results are meaningful for your hypothesis, but also that you explicitly think about why you're including these techniques in. So I'll give you a minute to write those, whichever might make sense for whatever you have for each of the bullet points that you've included. All right, let's move on just so we're not too far behind on time. So this is where we can move into the significance, and I don't spend a lot of time on this because I think this is almost the easiest part. It's kind of who should care, and usually when we write about kind of health science, it's obvious. And this is where these statements, abnormalities in cardiac rhythm account for more than 250,000 deaths per year in the US. They sort of fit more appropriately there. Because you're taking that scientific narrative and sending it off into how is this actually going to help? And I liked this one, as Canada's population is aging, heralding an expanding need for palliative care. My research intends to discover, explain, and reform these foundations in aid of improving life through improving dying. So that's essentially the rhetorical story but that's not what we focus because we're sending them off with that. I mean, that really is more the philosophical-ish side of things that we're not focusing on, but is important to include, but it's better at the end. So how that new is going to fit into the old, and then of course, who's going to benefit. So this is, we still have about 20 minutes left and we're going to focus on the editing parts, but this is kind of the back, or when we're making our outlines, like that creative side of things where you really have, infinite possibilities of what you're going to include. So in the background, we want to start with the gap in the research and then explain the set of certain circumstances. Your hypothesis should be 2 parts to make it intuitive, and it should just stand alone as its own statement that I can sort of at least get a good context for what your project's about and why. So in the methods, you want to list what and why, and importantly, really focus on what the results will show. So always have something to say, these results will show that, so that you can be accountable to the hypothesis and the purpose of your methods. And then the significance stating who will benefit. So for the last part, I'm going to move on to the review and editing. So obviously you won't have time to make your draft here, but we, after the draft, you have your sentences, and then we want to see what kind of language that we use. And actually that language used, it really does influence the reader's perception, not just of you, but of your proposal, of course, as well. And I want to show you how that changes and who you want to embody when writing these proposals. So some reference material, I had mentioned that Science of Scientific Writing. I think that's a must read for any scientist. You can Google that, it's a free article. And in the editing, I'm gonna highlight some of the things in this little pocket book. It's called The Elements of Style by William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web. They also made this little, it's not really a grammar book, but sort of in that line of things, called The Elements of Style. And it might be $10 or something, but if you're really interested in sort of language and writing, that may be something you want to pick up and read. But for sure, that first one, I think it's a must read for everyone. So I'll come back to this. So we talked about how to be logical and intuitive, but now I'm going to move into this like emotional appeal and credibility, because that's where the language that we use and the words actually influence the reader's feelings and perceptions of you, the writer. So pathos, this is the emotional appeal. So it's conveyed through appealing to their self-interest and using emotional and vivid language. So we're writing about health and sort of naturally important for everyone. But what we must do is remind them of the immediate importance of the health issue. So in this example, in the 1970s, the C-section rate in Canada started to increase. So of course, we aren't in 1970s, we're 2022. So we want to kind of reframe this to today. So today, over 20% of births are C-sections, up from 5% since the 1970s. So it's the same idea, but we're focusing more on today than from the 1970s. But I'll spend a lot more time on this credibility part, because this is the style and tone of voice and the way the writer might refer to differing views. And although writing is silent, you actually, when the reader is reading, your voice is actually inside their mind, and it's an incredibly powerful tool because you essentially have their undivided attention. And we want to make sure that the tone of our voice is in the context of a persuasive person. So we'll play a small game here. This may again seem a little odd, but you'll understand in a minute. Just want to do this for tone of voice. So I was participating in a market research study a long time ago, where kind of commercial companies would hire this research company to bring in consumers and ask them kind of strange questions about their products to kind of get an idea for how it's perceived. And this gave me the idea for this this game here. But what they asked was, what kind of personality traits does this scope bottle have? if it was a person. And I know it sounds strange, but if you can in the chat, just please engage with me here. Just there's no right or wrong, but what kind of, thank you. Okay, it's perfect. So anemic is one, but there's no right or wrong here. I just wonder what sort of person this might be. So partier, clean, great, friendly, serene, fresh. Okay, calm, thank you. Iron deficient, sounds good. Sick, okay, good vision. Organized. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. So that's great. So a lot of the words that had come up were, yeah, calm, nice, regimented. Right. So then they put up this picture, and then I wonder what sort of personality trait this Listerine bottle would have. And if you want to just put in the chat, perfect. So angry, strong, sterile, energetic, jock, in control, aggressive, bold, cold, unconventional, old-fashioned, prestigious, yeah, traditional, covetous. Thank you. That's great. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. And also a strange game. So nationalist, yeah. So a lot of those same themes came up. So yeah, strong, bold, obvious, came up when I was in that group as well. And it just got me thinking about kind of the tone of voice. And then when we're trying to persuade someone, who do we want to be? And essentially, I started thinking about like professionals in our society who do this for a living, persuade people, and like lawyers, of course, is what came to my mind. And I thought, like, who are they? They're more this Listerine bottle because they're pretty bold, they're really obvious, they're strong, they're firm. And that's the type of tone that you want to portray. And I want you just to remember, like, this isn't mean. The tone of voice isn't like angry and aggressive. It's just that you have made a choice, you've thought about it, and this experiment is super important, it has to be done. And that's the tone that you want to portray. So this confident, obvious, bold, concise, and well thought out, this is the type of person that you want to embody when you're writing. And as scientists, I think we're often sort of humbled because we really often kind of come out of our experiments feeling like, I don't know anything. And it is true, but we have to sort of differentiate that personality type from the proposal writer, because that's not how we persuade someone, by saying, I'm not sure, it might help, but really, I don't know. We have to frame it in a way that we are confident, obvious, bold, and concise, and that's who we want to be. So how do we make that happen on paper? So I'll go through these things here. Yeah, we've got good time here. So we'll use some definite language, omitting needless words. This first person may or may not apply. It depends. I'll come to that in a moment. But using the active voice, reducing unclear pronouns, and then I'll just go back to this sentence structure theory, but I'll go through these in a bit more detail. So this using definite language. So we want to prefer the specific to the general, the definite to the vague, and the concrete to the abstract. This is how we become sort of bold and obvious. And here's some examples. So formerly science was taught by the textbook method, while now the laboratory method is employed. Versus a more direct way is formerly science was taught by the textbook method, now it is taught by the laboratory method. So by being sort of definite, it shows that the writer has made a choice and abided by it, and that's who we want to be. And I'm gonna go into more specifics here about how we make that happen. So this kind of boils down to the strength of claim, which is really critical in science because you have to kind of defend all of your statements. And we defend those because we may have been very strong in the words we use or very kind of unsure about the words. And if we put them in the proper place, it's perfect. If we misplace them, then we run into trouble. But you want to consider how you present your thoughts and refer to published data. So you can be cautious by using hedges. That's these perhaps, maybe, could, might, may, or many more, or can be confident using these boosters like definitely, will, must, cannot, is. And these are critical because, again, if they're not put in the right place, undermines the whole persuasive elements of a proposal. So here we have plasticity is a major feature of smooth muscle cells and appears to underlie their pathogenicity. So the hedge here is appears to, and I would encourage you to think about, why am I being cautious here? If this is 20 years of research, I don't need to be cautious. I can be very firm about it, and I should be. Plasticity is a major feature of smooth muscle cells and underlies their pathogenicity. And so that embodies more of a strong, bold person. So these data from the proposed study may better define the molecular pathways of smooth muscle cell differentiation. So you'll notice the hedge there is may, and this is an awful place for a hedge in a proposal, because you're essentially saying that your study may or may not work. And that's definitely not the person that you want to put forward, especially to someone who's you're asking money for. So you have to be more confident. So these data from the proposed study will define novel molecular pathways of smooth muscle differentiation. Or if it's for training, for sure, you want to be in the first person. So my research will define define novel molecular pathways of smooth muscle cell differentiation. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but you can't be cautious when you're describing the importance of your research. So when you might want to use a hedge is when you're trying to minimize maybe incomplete research and strengthen your rationale. So in that first example, plasticity is a major feature of smooth muscle cells and appears to underlie their pathogenicity. Let's say that's actually the crux of your whole project. It's not 20 years of research, it's 0 years of research, but it's important. So we want to be cautious here. And it's important because then it will sort of help strengthen that rationale. So it appears to underlie their pathogenicity. However, no direct evidence observing plasticity exists in the literature. So we can be cautious here because it's important to be. So when you go back to read your draft, I would ask you to highlight your hedges and even your boosters and ask yourself, am I being cautious appropriately in this place? And if the answer is yes, then good. And if the answer is no, I should be more confident. But the way I've written it, I can't be, because the literature doesn't suggest this, but this is an area of the proposal where I really need to be strong. So you want to reframe it in a way that you can use those boosters like will and is, and not use words like may or perhaps. So you may have to just restructure the sentence to be more specific in a way that you can be confident. So the next part's omitting needless words, which sounds obvious, but the way people write may actually create some wordier sentences. And I'll just introduce this nominalizations. So I'm not an English major, and when I write, I don't kind of think about these technical sides of things, but actually when you understand this, it might actually change the way that you start writing. So the nominalization is when we create the noun from a verb, adjective, or adverb. So some examples here, the noun being measurement and the verb being measure, or applicability and the verb is applicable, or movement and the verb is move. So when we use the noun or adjective or adverb side of it, the nominalization, it creates wordier sentences. And these are sort of abstract nouns, but we want to try to use the verb counterpart, so more action oriented type of sentences, and I'll show you some examples. So the highlighted in red is the abstract noun. So the experiment involves the combination of the two chemicals, but we should write in a more action-driven way. So I want to use the verb, which is combine. So I will combine the two chemicals. So much shorter, very direct, and very obvious. Next being an evaluation will be undertaken as an investigation of the measurements obtained from the clinical cohort. So it's just a terrible sentence. We've all read ones like this. We've read whole papers that overuse these nominalizations, and probably if you've had to reread a paper 3 times, it's probably because they're overusing, or using these abstract nouns rather than the verbs. So the counterpart here might be the clinical cohort will be evaluated based on the investigated measures. So again, much shorter and easier to understand. So when you go back, I would highlight the nominalizations and try to change the verb. It will change the sentence, but it will make it shorter and hopefully a lot more concise. You may not need to change everyone, but at least try and see how that works. If you can't find them, sometimes they end in like TION or MENT. Those, it's just like a quick scan, can highlight those and try to change those to the verb. And that will actually train your brain even to like write in a more action-oriented type of writing style. So the first person may or may not apply. So it would place yourself in the context of the research. So it answers the who. It's important for training applications because they do explicitly ask for the trainee's role in the project. So you kind of have to use I in those contexts. For other types of grants, it may not be appropriate. So this is a little flexible, but for the training ones, it is important to use I. So simply just instead of saying, so to ensure the activity of caspase 3, 7, and 9 are not completely due to SMAC Diablo release from mitochondria, SMAC Diablo deficient mice will be used. So it's not clear who's doing that. So instead, you can just say, I will use SMAC Diablo deficient mice, and then the rest. So I don't think it's a complicated part. It's just kind of, if you decide you need to use first person, you can just initiate writing in that way. So the active voice, this is where the subject is performing the action, and usually the subject and the verb are kind of like next to each other. And this is a bit of like in that elements of style and even the science of scientific writing. It's much clearer when the subject of the sentence and the verb are next to each other or as close as possible. It makes for understanding kind of the context of what's happening easier rather than when they're farther apart, which is kind of more in the passive voice. So the active voice is more direct. It usually takes less words and identifies ownership and responsibility. Just because probably we don't talk about this a lot, I have just some easy examples. So the active here is the ox pulled the cart, and the passive, so the ox being the subject and the verb being pulled next to each other. So, and then the next was passive being the cart was pulled by the ox. And then the other one is being Steve made mistakes in the office, and the passive, which doesn't identify any ownership in the office, mistakes were made. So in the science kind of example, the subject here is CMIB, and it's playing the role. So given the role played by CMIB in the regulation of cell cycle dependent calcium, it would be worthwhile to compare and contrast its involvement in erythroid maturation with that in smooth muscle cell differentiation. So I want to really, that's passive, given the role played by CMIB. I want to highlight the subject, CMIB. So if I just actually bring that to the front of the sentence, it will force it into active voice. So since CMIB plays a role, now we're in active voice because the subject and the verb are close. In the regulation of cell cycle dependent calcium, it would be worthwhile to compare and contrast its involvement in erythroid maturation. So we think about like a 9-to-1 ratio of active and passive. This kind of, I should say, it's sort of pulled out of nowhere. It doesn't mean like that's not the actual number. But what I want to say here is that you should use active more often than passive. We don't always write active every time, but more often it's better to write in the active voice. So just highlighting the subject right at the front of the sentence. So the next one is the unclear pronouns. We want to avoid these. So that might be that it or a this. And we use these because we want to try to avoid repetition, but it's almost a good thing, that repetition, because we want to drive home that message. Because by using these, it takes away emphasis of the topic. So it's unclear. And if I forget, then it's frustrating for me because I have to go back and remind myself. And the reader always forgets. Remember that. So in that same sentence, I had given about the passive voice. we have here, it would be worthwhile to compare its involvement. These are unclear pronouns, which I think are malplaced. We can be a lot more specific. So what is it? And it is essentially CMIP involvement in erythroid maturation and smooth muscle cell differentiation. So what I've done here is change this to active voice and changed or removed the its to be more specific to CMIP as well. So as you go back through your draft, I would highlight the its in this and then just think about what it is and try to change it. If it doesn't make sense or it doesn't feel right, then you don't have to change it. But if it's better to change it so that you can meet the reader's expectations of essentially not forgetting what you're talking about. All right, that's perfect. So we can move into the last section. I'm just going to kind of edit a paragraph. And we had talked about this before, this sort of topic position and stress position, that that's where the old information sits, and then we kind of transition into these new information. But when you have your paragraphs, you might want to just sort of zero in on what you have at the beginnings of the sentences. Because in this one here, I'll read it later, but the first parts of the sentences are very unclear. They're abstract and aren't very meaningful. Currently, results from this proposal, more specifically, this will be therapeutically, kind of doesn't say much about the person's project itself. So I'd like to just edit this sentence by sentence. So currently, one of the biggest controversies is whether Kawasaki disease is a superantigen or conventional peptide-mediated disease. And that is not a terrible first sentence in a sense, because it's kind of getting at the research story. But we're really not highlighting whether it's about Kawasaki disease or superantigen. So let's say it's about superantigen. So a superantigen or conventional peptide-mediated progression of Kawasaki disease is unknown. So this is more kind of tailored to the superantigen and more direct. Then results from this proposal may help solidify our hypothesis that superantigens expand a subpopulation of autoreactive T cells with specificity towards the coronary artery. More specifically, it may identify a subset of pathogenic T cells responsible for the persistence of inflammation in the coronary artery. And so I hope as I read that, you sort of identified the hedge and how horribly placed it would be there, because it undermines your whole project. And you've just done yourself an incredible disservice only because of that one word. And that's not the research story you want to set up. That's one where all the results are meaningful and the project must be done. And if you have to repeat that to yourself 10 times every day, just to get yourself in that mindset, this is an important aspect of proposal writing and even any project, because that's how you want to design your experiment, is that all the results being meaningful and that this project has to be done. So we have to change that to my project will determine whether superantigens expand a subpopulation of autoreactive T cells for persistence of inflammation in the coronary artery. And then the last part is this will be invaluable in future studies as it provides a screening method in our search for autoreactive peptide. Therapeutically, identification of these T cells allow for targeting strategies to prevent localization of the disease to the heart and heart damage in affected children. So we have an unclear pronoun here, like this will be, and maybe therapeutically is not super descriptive. We really want to highlight the superantigen, so let's just put that at the beginning. So a superantigen generated screening method to search for autoreactive T cells and peptides is crucial for the development of targeting strategies that will prevent localization of the disease to coronary arteries. So I went from this kind of highlighting the beginning parts of the sentences to try to focus it on superantigens and be more direct, to a much shorter direct paragraph. So just to summarize, I had mentioned using definite language to differentiate why you want to use a hedge and a booster. omitting needless words and unclear pronouns. So checking your nominalization and trying to write in a more action-oriented and verb-focused. You may want to use I if appropriate, but try to use the active voice. So put the subject, highlight it right in the front, and tie the verb right next to it. And kind of think about your starts of the sentences. This might actually help make you be more direct. So I have mentioned this reference if you're interested in it. It's helpful, but I highlighted some of the things in there that I think were relevant for proposal writing. And I think these editing details can be worried about last. Really, the structure, flow, and content are key parts, because when you have that clear, the rest sort of comes naturally. If you're confident in your project, you'll be confident in your writing. So I'll just conclude here by, I know it's kind of a strange thing to say, but I think you should turn into this Listerine bottle, or the person that, or not all of it. I guess there were some kind of not so great things about it, but be that persuasive person when you sit down to write. So be logical, credible, and confident, and appeal to their interests. And of course, I wish you all the best of luck. Of course, read a lot and be ready to write at any moment, because those sentences come to you in the middle of the street. So take your phone out and just write it down. Don't feel weird, because you'll forget it later. So just when it pops in your mind, just take it out. And of course, be patient. So thank you very much. I think I will end there, and I can take questions, or we can wait till sort of the end. I think there's a second part to this lecture. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. We can take a couple of questions now and then move on to the next section. So we'll say give 5 minutes for questions.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I have one here. It says, in case of non-trainee proposals, should we use we plus active or passive phrases? So in non-trainee ones, you might want to use we, because it may not be you if you're sort of the primary scientist. You're not necessarily in the lab, but we is appropriate. Or if it makes sense, you may actually want to identify exactly who, like if you have someone in the lab already doing that, or if you're hiring someone, or there's like a core facility, you may want to be specific for that. But active phrases are more preferential than the passive. So yeah, you want to try to use the active voice more than the passive voice.
If anybody else has questions for Dr. Sabatini, please feel free to put them in the chat. I had a question for you when you were discussing avoiding the use of pronouns. It made me think about how often a lot of people use acronyms because they want to keep it shorter, and they want to keep, not repeating the same long sentences over and over again, or the long phrases over and over again. But is there that same logic that we should try to avoid some acronyms because people might get lost?
Yeah, the acronyms can be a challenge, especially when you have like the CIHR proposal. It's like impossibly short, essentially, and so the use of acronyms kind of like heightens in those. But I always try to remind people that you're trying to make it easier for the reader. Like, I am not only learning about your project, but then I'm also learning a whole new language. So you're putting a lot of burden on me as the reader, and you want to avoid that. So the acronyms can be helpful, but think about how much burden you're putting on me as the reader. So some make sense because they're obvious. Like, I can't think of an example, but like, CBC, for example, I don't know if it would make it in your proposal, but that's a colloquial acronym. Of course, use those, no problem. But if you're teaching me a new one, those should be limited to 0 or very limited. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I don't see any more questions for now, so maybe we'll move on to the next section. And if anybody has questions for Dr. Sabatini, you can continue to put them in the chat. Thank you so much, Dr. Sabatini, for sharing
Thank you.
all of those resources. Many of you have messaged me and asked, and we will definitely be sharing the recording. It's such a useful thing to be able to pull it up when you're writing and review the things and make sure that you're following these guidelines. So I think that'll be a very helpful tool. I also wanted to say, we'll pop it in here just in case people have to leave, but we really appreciate your feedback on the workshop. So if you can please take a couple of minutes after the workshop to fill in our feedback form. I'll also share it at the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to mention it now. And I've put the link in the chat. Okay, with that, we are so excited to introduce the next speakers. And we have 3 speakers here from the UHN Research Grants Office. We have Maria Canoe, Rachel Thomason, and Lorraine Chu. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thanks, Dr. Sabatini, for a great presentation. You have reminded me how incredibly hard people work on their actual submissions for funding. And I know it's an extremely competitive environment, so I'm sure that this resource is going to be a vital tool for people. So thank you. So we're going to take you out of the intense writing and bring you into the process around how do you actually get the approvals that you need to submit your application. So one of the things I would say right off the top is please do not email Brad Wouters directly. That's not the best way to go about it. And if there's only one thing you take away from this part of the presentation, it would be that email that you see on the screen, grants@uhnresearch.ca. Please just email us anytime. Let us know, I want to apply to this. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get the approvals. We will help you facilitate all of it. And it doesn't even submit. It's better that you tell us as soon as you know that this is something, an opportunity that you would like to apply to. We'll make it clear to you and set out the steps that you need to take to ensure you have all the approvals and all the signatures from UHN in order to submit the application before the deadline. We will go on to discuss some of the platforms where applications are submitted. I strongly encourage you to anticipate technical difficulties and to the extent possible, not to leave it to the last minute. We have scrambled in the past for PIs and trainees alike to reach out to funding agencies and have them to consider an application that encountered a technical difficulty and could not be submitted before the deadline through the funders platform. So jot down that email address, take a screenshot of it on your phone and just reach out to us. So if we could have the next slide. Thank you. So what we're going to discuss with you today is the application process. And this talks about notification to us. It talks about the type of review that we do. And I'll make it very clear here as well, we're not reviewing your scientific content. That is something that you discuss with your supervisor, with your principal investigator. And if we have any PIs as part of the workshop, if your institute has an internal review process, then that would be something you would take there. But I know that in many instances, people stress a little if they think they have to have the scientific component written before they engage our office. Please rest assured that's not required, and we won't be asking you for that as part of our review. And then we want to talk to you about the approval and submission phase. Next slide, thanks. So I think here, Amanda, it would be best if you could take us to the Research Grants intranet page. So for our attendees, hopefully all of you have access to UHN intranet, to the corporate intranet and to the research intranet. And if you search under departments, you'll find research grants. And this is our webpage, which has a lot of really helpful information for you that you will need when you're completing your application. So if you just scroll down a little, Thanks, Amanda. So it takes you through the 3 steps that we've discussed, which is the notification, the review, and the approval. But I do want to highlight to you the last 2 tabs. First, if we could go to institutional registration numbers. So for many of your applications, you're going to need these numbers. They'll be required to be completed in the form. We'll check that you have the right numbers in your form. And if you forget where it is, we'll help you to find it again. But just remember, the Research Grants Intranet page does have all of this information. And similarly, if you click on institutional contacts, you have the formal institution name, which is University Health Network. Although your supervisors and you will be working with distinct research institutes at UHN, the legal name for the applications is University Health Network, and that's the address that we use. And then we've also given you the financial officer's name and address, which is often required, who our institutional authority is, and that of course is Dr. Wouters, and then our media contact, which is Gillian Howard, which is not in every application, but in many applications is also required. So you can find all of that information on the intranet page for research grants. If we could go back to the presentation, thanks. So this was just a screenshot of the page that I showed you, and so we can go on through to the next slide. And just to break it down, in our intranet page, you can click on each of these steps on the how to apply for a grant, and it'll give you more information about the process that's involved. Next slide, thank you. So one of the biggest decisions I think that you encounter as a trainee is, am I applying through UHN or am I applying through U of T? And it's fairly common for us to receive requests for help where people don't know, or they put the other institutions. So please be reminded that we are separate institutions. And one of the, there are 3 key considerations that we encourage you and your supervisor to think about. The first is UHN eligible for the opportunity? And we'll go on to discuss some opportunities that UHN is not eligible for, and MyTax and NSERC would be 2 key ones where you actually must apply through U of T. We're going to talk to you a little bit about how you submit the applications through U of T and how you notify UHN if you intend to conduct any of the research activities at UHN. So the first question to think about is UHN eligible? The second, if we can go back, the second point to think about is where will the research be conducted? And the third is where will your stipend be paid? Is it through UHN or is it through U of T? So if you're in a situation where both institutions are eligible, but the research is being conducted at UHN and your stipend is paid through UHN, then I would strongly encourage you to apply through UHN. If, however, the research is happening at U of T and your stipend is paid at U of T, then we would say to you, we'd be happy to submit this, but you're going to have delays while we do a sub out post award to U of T. So just submit through U of T. So there's some of the questions to think about. Next slide, thank you. And I'm just going to talk briefly about this, and then Rachel's going to take over and talk us through some of the actual opportunities and platforms. But these are some of the common trainee funding opportunities that we see, and you'll see we've highlighted NSERC and SHRC, which must be submitted through the My Research account, the supervisor's My Research account at U of T. And SHRC, while UHN is not eligible for SHRC, the institute, Michener Institute, is eligible for SHRC, but your supervisor would need to be appointed at the Institute of Education Research at TIER in order to submit an application to SHRC. So otherwise, that application would be submitted through the U of T. In terms of just examples of some of the most common applications that we see for trainees, there's CIHR fellowships, the Alzheimer's Society postdoc fellowship, or the Craig H. Nelson Foundation. And actually, Amanda, let's take people, and do you want to just comment briefly on the updated resource that ORT has in terms of funding opportunities?
Yes. We've recently been doing a relaunch of our website, and we're still in the process. But what we've done is, in the meantime, create a Excel file with all of the different funding opportunities for graduate students and postdocs that we know about and that we think that you're eligible for, you might be eligible for. And let me put it up here. What we've done for now is just link it on our website. So if you go to the ORT website and you go to trainee resources, if you hit funding, you'll enter this page. And if you click here where it says 2022-06-22 training funding opportunities, it'll download an Excel file, and it's all organized by the name of the grant, the granting agency. You can see when the usual deadlines are. You can see lots of different information. There's information on funding opportunities that are specific to different fields. So there's many of them that are specific to Alzheimer's or neurosciences or things like that, as well as general funding opportunities that are available to everyone. We also have a tab specifically for conference grants and conference awards, so things you can apply to help you with funding to attend conferences. Now that page is a little bit less than it usually is because many of these grants got whittled down during the pandemic, but we will be constantly expanding and updating that file as we find more opportunities for you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amanda. One of the key points that I was reminded of when I looked at the webpage is that research grants is involved when you're applying to an external funding organization. So if you're applying for the internal opportunities through ORT that were mentioned at the start of this workshop, or you're applying for an internal opportunity that your research or your supervisor's research institute is hosting, then you don't need to submit the application to grants for review or institutional approval. If you're not sure, just email us and we'll let you know. That's the easiest way to resolve it. It's better to reach out to us, and it's an easy, we don't need to work together, or else we'll pop you on our granting calendar and we'll make sure that we support you through the application process. So could we have the next slide? So Rachel, I'm going to ask you to speak to U of T and how trainees would submit an application there and identify participation or research to be conducted at UHN.
Thanks, Maria. So as Maria said, if you and your supervisor decide that submitting your application through U of T is the best option, your supervisor or the principal investigator, in terms of the language used in MRA, will need to submit an MRA through U of T. So it is the My Research Application System. And this will route the application internally for the U of T approvals required for the submission. Next slide, please. So you'll want to make sure when the MRA is being completed that you select UHN from the drop-down menu in terms of the location of research activities. And this will ensure that the MRA is routed to UHN, so to research grants for our approval. And this is just an internal requirement if UHN is a location of research. So this is nothing with the agency itself, the funding agency. And then if we need to clarify anything with you and or the supervisor, we will reach out directly prior to our internal approval. Next slide, please. So the other two online portals that we use a lot for submissions is ResearchNet, that CIHR uses for their application submissions, and Proposal Central. So as we noted in a previous slide, Craig H. Nielsen is a funder that we often see for fellowship applications, as well as Bright Focus Agency. So we've just highlighted those two as key ones, but there could be other agencies that use Proposal Central as well. Next slide. So if you are going to be applying to CIHR, they have several fellowship opportunities. We've highlighted three. the Doctoral Research Award, the Banting Postdoc Fellowship, and the Postdoc Fellowship. So most of these will require, most of all fellowship opportunities through CIHR will require a signature page, and they will not utilize the e-approval process. Next slide, please. So the one thing to always note and make sure you do is when you are selecting your institution, select University Health Network, which has the code ADHD, and this will ensure that the application is routed through our office if there is an e-approval process, and that at the time of submission, the correct institution is noted, and subsequently, if your application is awarded, that the correct institution is noted on all of the award documents. Next slide, please. So the other important thing to note, again, is the location of performance and institution paid. So again, it's University Health Network with the code ADHD. However, if you are going through U of T, we have noted here that it's University of Toronto with the code CEAA, just for your reference. Next slide. So again, as I noted, most of the fellowship opportunities utilize a hard signature requirement and not the e-approval process. So if you have any questions about which approval process is being used, you can find it at the bottom of the funding detail page in ResearchNet, but please feel free to reach out to Research Grants and we will determine which approval process CIHR is using for that funding opportunity and ensure that we take care of the approval process accordingly. So in terms of the signature page, actually next slide, please. So this is an example of the routing slip and signature page. They are generated together as one PDF from when you're downloading it from ResearchNet. So you'll note that while you don't need to apply because you are the applicant, your supervisor's signature will be required. They'll be identified in the participant section, and then the institutional signature is required on the last page. So we will ensure that the appropriate signatory signs in the sections applicable to your funding opportunity and return the signature page to you prior to the deadline. Next slide. So in terms of Proposal Central, we are able to access the applications by being given access to your applications. So this slide highlights how you would do that. So when you are in your application, under tab 3, you would identify our EVP research email address as a user to be given access. And this will route the application to our office in terms of being able to access it online so we can review the budget, budget justification if applicable, and all the administrative information required for the institution. And we will review it that way and then provide you feedback as necessary. Next slide. So again, the two key pieces of information is to always indicate University Health Network as your institution, and that your institution paid in ResearchNet specifically is University Health Network. And I think that's it for me.
So I think I just want to pause there and say that we have had instances where people have either put in their research institute, so the Princess Margaret Cancer Centre or Kite Research Institute, and so we're unaware of the application. We can't find it in the system to give your approval, so it's really important to remember it's UHN. And we've also had instances where we've received funding unexpectedly because UHN was noted as the institution to be paid when the application was submitted from elsewhere. So those tips are really important, and it comes right back to that initial determination of where is the best place for this fellowship to be paid? Is it U of T or is it UHN? And we're happy to work with you. We work very collaboratively with the grants team at U of T, with Drew's team over there, so we can pull them as well into any discussions as well if we want some clarity in terms of how it's going to flow post-award. And so we just want to have a little chat about post-award. It's a lot of writing here, but for the CIHR Fellowship Awards, recall that you will receive an offer form and it does require an institutional signature. So please send those to us as soon as you receive them, and we'll facilitate that signature for you and send it back so you can accept your award within the time limits imposed by the funder. We have a lot of varieties of notices of award that come in. Some require an institutional signature, some need your signature, some need your supervisor's signature. The best thing to do is send us a copy regardless. We do like to collect info. We love to hear about success stories and when people have been funded, and to help facilitate your transition over to our colleagues in research finance, and also to ensure that the cost center is opened up so that there is access to that funding in a timely manner. Of course, where the agreement does need a signature, then we'll facilitate that. And also, if you actually receive an agreement, they take a little longer to review because they're generally more substantive terms and conditions. There might be intellectual property provisions as well that we need to look at. There might be additional requirements or encumbrances that the funder is seeking. So if you do receive an award and it comes with a research agreement, please send that to us as soon as you can, so we can make sure to have that reviewed and have an opportunity to request any edits if we agree as an office and with you and your supervisor that it's worthwhile to seek those edits. So it's 3:57, I think. Is that us at the end? Yeah, so we don't have a lot of time for questions, but if anyone does have any, please pop them in the chat. I'll just give everyone a moment to say that. And again, I would reiterate, grants at uhnresearch.ca. No question is a silly question. Just reach out to us if you're not sure if you're eligible, if you're not sure if you should apply from UHN or U of T. If you just don't know how to go about the mechanics of getting your application submitted, then what we do is we want to make that as smooth a process as possible for you so that you can focus on writing your application and getting the science right, and listening to those tips again that Dr. Sabatini provided to you in terms of getting a great proposal. I'll hand it back to you, Amanda. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. And for anyone who is planning on applying to Banting this year, the Grants Office has done a wonderful job of preparing a document with tips, and you can email me and I will pass that along to all of you for guidance. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming today. We really appreciate it. We hope you've learned a lot from our wonderful speakers. If you'd like to learn more about the different kinds of offerings that the ORT provides, please check out our website. Dr. Sabatini often gives other kinds of grant writing sessions through the School of Graduate Studies, so make sure to check that out during the year if you want to take more writing workshops. And lastly, I just want to say thank you again to all of our speakers, Dr. Peter Sabatini, Maria Canu, and Rachel Thomason. So thank you very much.